Is remarriage adultery? This question comes from the teachings of Jesus about divorce and remarriage. You find it in Matthew 19:9. Let me read it to you. Jesus said, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery. Notice, and marries another woman commits adultery. So there's the idea that that second marriage is adultery. Well, the Roman Catholic Church believes that's what Jesus meant. Therefore, they do not perform second marriages, for they would believe that they are creating an adulterous affair. So how does the Catholic Church get around to doing a second marriage? Well, they have to declare that the first marriage did not exist. It's called annulment. So maybe a man or a woman will apply for an annulment, and they will basically say to the Catholic Church, I don't believe that this marriage was really a true marriage. It was just fornication. And so if they can convince the Catholic Church to do that, then the Catholic Church provides an annulment, and therefore they can do that second marriage, because in the mind of the Catholic Church, the first one did not exist. Well, that's how the Catholic Church gets around this passage. Protestants haven't been nearly as creative, so they don't know really what to do with the passage. Well, the answer to me is actually more simpler than you think. Jesus was actually dealing with the hypocrisy of the Pharisees because they knew adultery was wrong, so they knew they couldn't commit adultery. So what do they do instead? They had this mistress that they wanted to commit adultery, but they couldn't do it. So what do? They divorced their wives so they could marry the mistress. And so that new marriage was not adultery because they were legally divorced. What Jesus was doing is he was saying you're hypocrites, because God knows the intent of the divorce. You're getting divorced so you can marry this mistress in waiting. And when you do marry her, I can tell you, you have committed adultery. So Jesus is not saying if you get a divorce and then 2-3 years later you meet someone and you marry them, that's adultery. No, because you did not divorce to marry that person. So Jesus was actually dealing with one and the same act, the divorcing in order to marry, not a divorce and then later on finding someone and you marry. Now we find in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, who's quite familiar with the teachings of Jesus Christ in the Gospels, he even quoted from Jesus in 1 Corinthians 7. But watch what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 27, 28, concerning divorced Christians. Watch what he says. He says, art thou, and I'm going to read it from the King James because I believe the King James is more accurate. It doesn't get into politics, doesn't try to translate something to make certain denominations happy with the interpretation. So listen to this passage. Paul says, art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. Notice, art thou loose? What's loose? You were divorced. That means you were bound. You got loose from one. But watch this, verse 28. But if thou marry, who's the thou? The one who is loose from the wife. That is someone who got a divorce. But if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Notice two people. One who has not been married, the virgin, and the one who was married, got a divorce, and married again. You know what Paul says? Neither of them have sinned. So Paul did not understand the teachings of Christ about divorce and remarrying to mean if you got a divorce, you got loose from a wife, later on, you end up getting married. He doesn't say that's a sin, because Paul understood Jesus was dealing with the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. So in answer to the question, is it a sin? Is it adultery if you remarry? It all depends. Did you get the divorce to marry this person? Did you hear me? If you're getting the divorce to marry this person, then even if you marry them, you are an adulterer in that new marriage. It doesn't matter if the state declares that the marriage is gone and that your new marriage is legitimate. Even though the law says your marriage is legitimate, God says, I know the heart. I know your motive. See, the court and the state cannot judge motives. They just lay out the facts as they see them. But God is different. He can judge the motive of our hearts. So in answer to the question, if you got a divorce and later on you meet someone and you feel like this is the person you to marry, you're not forbidden to marry that person. Okay? Only way you would be forbidden is if you're divorcing your present spouse so you can marry this person. In that case, that new marriage will be adultery. And some of you, I hate to tell you this, you are an adulterous marriage because you married the person you wanted to marry, and that's why you got a divorce to begin with. Jesus is dealing with the heart matter, and that's the meaning behind divorcing to marry another, and it's adultery. Jesus was referring to motives.